Thank you, Adrian. That was beautiful. It was beautiful, and it's a beautiful day. But it still goes, doesn't it? The heartbreak, the difficulties, the struggle of women the world over for their recognition, for their power, for their love. My mother tells a story of me as a boy growing up in the Unitarian Fellowship in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, where we were learning stories about the Bible. We teach that here in our curriculum too, just some basic biblical literacy. Now this was in the 1960s, mind you, so things were a little different, but the teacher was teaching us from Genesis about how God created the earth and the heavens, the vast stars, the deepest sea, that however our young minds would perceive that ultimate power, there was, she said, a creative force that was in all of our lives. And through a long evolution, we became who we are, not the on the sixth day thing, but something a little longer than that. And I was tracking all of this as an 8-year-old, sort of, kind of, until they got to the story about Sarah and Hagar. Now, you'll remember from your Bible, won't you, good Unitarian Universalists, you'll remember this, of course, the story of Hagar and Sarah, but Abraham and Sarah married late. She was 66, he was 84. And Sarah could not bear children, so she offered up her enslaved handmaiden, Hagar, to be raped by her husband. That's not the word that was used, but that's what it was. And it was Hagar who actually bore Abraham's first child, Ishmael, who later would play into the story of Islam as one of the founding prophets, but that's another story for another day. To make matters worse, Sarah became jealous of Hagar and banished her and her child into the desert to die. They don't die, and that's also another story for another day. But as I heard about this, I thought, now wait a minute. We just learned in our course about your sexuality that unconsented sex was wrong. So then, how's this right? I asked the teacher. This arrangement. How did Hagar feel about this? And the poor volunteer teacher didn't have a clue or an answer, so she left the question unanswered, which was probably fine. And when I asked my mother about this later, my beloved mother, she said, the men tell the stories, the women didn't count. For millennia, ever since the destruction of the ancient goddess cults, the Madonna, the Mary, Mother of Jesus, I think for many Catholics has been a stealth goddess to whom women and many turn for solace and support, the divine and accepting feminine of the heart, to escape the wrath and the condemnation of God the Father, or perhaps even Jesus the Son. But what's less known about the divine feminine is that it resides in other women in the Bible, which almost all of them are named Mary. So it gets very confusing, this Mary business, but Mary the mother, of course, and then there's Mary Magdalene, who I'm going to talk about today, his closest disciple. Some would say his wife, and we'll get to that in a second, who only up until 1969, Mary Magdalene was officially portrayed as a prostitute. Conflated by Pope Gregory back in the 1700s, this pope who thought the woman who was washing Jesus' feet with her hair and pouring on the perfume, who the Bible portrays as a prostitute, was the same Mary Magdalene who was Jesus' most beloved disciple. There's other Marys, and there's Mary, the sister of Martha, who's always there with love, and then there's Martha, who is the antithesis of Mary, concerned with domestic duties. And there's a juxtaposition there. That's another story for another time. But the point here is, in this Gospel of John, this Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the most beloved disciple, and most biblical literalists over the years have said that John was the most beloved disciple. So how is this right, and what is going on here? Mary Magdalene was a very powerful character. I would say that all these Marys in the Bible, for them to have survived 2,000 years of severe patriarchy, says something about their character. The difficulty resides in a patriarchal society such as early Judaism of how to deal with women within its codex. Women, whether disciples or characters, those who Jesus interact with, were part of the story in ways that are not easily identifiable when you read the four Gospels. But of course, there are more than four Gospels. There's 50-plus Gospels that were discovered in Nag Hammadi on the edge of the Dead Sea many years ago. And these fragments of these Gospels, which are known as the Gnostic Gospels, are actually, some of them, earlier than the first known Gospel and the four we know of, the Gospel of Mark. Some of these date to just decades after Jesus died, as opposed to Mark, which is the year 70 or 75, if Jesus died in the year 30. So there's something going on around here. There's some other message that is being hidden and is emerging of the divine feminine within this ministry of Jesus and perhaps within the existing Christian church. What's truly remarkable about the story is that the women have a significant part to play in his ministry. Now, they're not the so-called 12, all men, you know. They're the ones who go before. They're the ones who are the advance team. They're the ones, probably Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene, who went into the villages to prepare them for Jesus' coming. But it was Mary Magdalene who was said in her gospel that Jesus loved her above all others and often kissed her on the mouth. Now, how does that survive 2,000 years of patriarchy? Mary Magdalene represented, I believe, an entire movement, a feminine movement within this early Christian movement, this ethos of love and radical acceptance that we may not easily understand. And despite the condemnation of his male associates, the disciples, Mary Magdalene represents this creative power which is coupled with this grit, this life story that points us to something beyond what we normally see as the patriarchy of early Christianity. Clearly, she was a complex figure. According to the canonical Gospels of Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John, she was wealthy enough to support Jesus' entire ministry. There are other Gospels of the 50 that support Mary Magdalene's existence, but more importantly, this primacy in his life. Mary Magdalene must have possessed a love that was greater than even those of the disciples. And the church has done the best it can to separate out that love and say that it was non-physical. But how do we know that? How do we know that it wasn't that deep, abiding love which can be spiritual and physical at the same time? And what was that love all about? And what was Jesus doing? First, as it says in the early Gospels, it says he exorcised the 7 demons within her. These aren't demons of lust. These are demons of being lost. Perhaps being lost and persecuted. And regardless of what history says, there must have been an aching pathos, a pathos of incredible power in Mary Magdalene's life, that she was connected to this charismatic and very powerful figure that was Jesus. It's in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene that Jesus imparted his key teachings, hidden teachings, that is say, about the true nature of God. It's in that we hear the Aramaic Kindom instead of kingdom. That's the line that from the Aramaic does make its way into the Bible, but it is translated into Hebrew, and the Hebrew to Greek, and the Greek to Latin, and then we get his kingdom. But Mary Magdalene was talking about his kingdom. The story of Mary Magdalene's role in the Bible contains these deep truths, these truths about staying together, about holding on to intuition, about dealing with that which holds our emotions and keeps that emotions the kind of intelligence long before we had words like emotional intelligence. But what I will say is that while we don't know a lot about what happened to her, or to Jesus for that matter, there is archaeological and scriptural evidence that is significant, and I want to tell you a little bit about it. Because I think there is a chance, off chance though it might be, that perhaps Jesus did not die on a cross. That perhaps his body survived that execution and was nursed back to life by the Marys in his life, Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene. These influential women were there carefully at his side from the beginning to the end. They were the ones, if you remember the story, they were the ones who stayed by the cross. The disciples, fearing for their lives, the guys, they literally head for the hills. But the women stay. It's quite possible that as this was happening, we were seeing something else in the midst of the tragedy of a gruesome death of the revolutionary that Jesus was. Mary Magdalene. Actually, it's not Mary Magdalene like that's her last name. It's Mary the Magdalene of Magdala. Magdalene, which actually means tower in Aramaic, was actually a little village, and there was a tower on top of a hill, and she came from that place. But she was actually part of a branch of the house of David, and it's possible, say some scholars, that she was sort of a proto-princess, a Jewish princess. There's little doubt that she was wealthy, but that wasn't from prostitution. There's a great deal of evidence that she was partnered with Jesus in some very vulnerable and deep way. The assumption that Jesus was celibate and single not only doesn't fit some of the later Gospels, but it also doesn't fit the reality of Jewish society in the first century. The wedding feast at Cana, for instance, as told in the Gospel of John, gives you a glimpse of the possibility that something else was going on. And if you remember this, and I know you all know this, you remember the story, the wedding where they are there and Jesus' mother comes to him and says, "Jesus, we're out of wine." And he goes, "Oh, woman, what have I to do with you?" he says, very disrespectful of his mother. And then he says, "Bring the servants over with the containers of the wine." He makes a blessing and he says, "Now have the chief steward serve the wine." The water turns into wine. And the chief steward, of course, is amazed and he says, "Wow, the bridegroom usually serves the good wine first and the bad wine later after people are drunk, but no, you did it the other way around. You're remarkable." And the question is, why is Jesus giving orders at somebody else's wedding? Really, think about that. According to Jewish custom, the groom is responsible for the wine. Is it possible that this was Jesus' wedding? The real miracle, not turning water into wine, but that Jesus was married to his beloved disciple? Not John, perhaps, but Mary. Or is it possible that John and Mary Magdalene were the same person? Is this the reason the church decided to portray her as a prostitute in order to disassociate her from Jesus and therefore keep him pure in some patriarchal way? Is it possible that this earthly relationship between a man and a woman was the creative power that led to his revolutionary ideas? After all, it was Mary Magdalene in the Gospels who witnesses Jesus after the crucifixion and says, my Lord, my Rabbi, my beloved," as it says in the Aramaic. So there's evidence that Jesus might have survived the crucifixion, perhaps as it has been fictionalized by Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Codes, you all know about that he eventually went to southern France and had a vineyard and life was good. And I don't know. Hey, I can think of worse things. There's a possibility. I mean, there's a whole mythic realm that's built up around this idea that he went to southern France with Mary Magdalene. The Knights Templar, an ancient order of the church, was dedicated to protecting the chalice and the pilgrims going to Jerusalem, but their major presence was in Toulouse in the south of France, along with another group, a later group called the Cathars. Could the real chalice really have been the womb of Mary Magdalene? Now, we're not going to know that answer. Not possible. But what we do know is that there's great power here. There's a nexus of the divine feminine which is coming in contact with the wisdom that Jesus had. And there's this understanding that perhaps, indeed in our own lives, the real story is the radical teaching that Jesus put forth first when he said, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." Where would an itinerant preacher with absolutely no standing on his own, remember, he wasn't even a carpenter's son, he was a laborer's son, learn to heal the sick and give comfort to the downfallen? Where would the Messiah stoop down on the ground? Remember this poignant image where they're about to stone a woman to death for adultery. Forget the guy, he's off scot-free. They're about to stone the woman, and he's there drawing in the sand, and he says, "Those without sin cast the first stone." Where would he have gotten those ideas but from someone who taught him the power of the feminine? What we do know is that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene most of all. It's over and over, it's said. And although the women's stories are conflated into something between virgins and harlots, Mary perhaps was the one who took care of him at the end. Was it Mary who defended him to the male disciples as doing God's work, despite their constant doubting? Was it not Mary Magdalene who the Gospels are really referring to and not John? Yes, there's the picture. There on Jesus' right hand. Who is that? It's a very feminized picture. Could be a trans person, we don't know. Could be Mary Magdalene. Traditionally, the right side is the most beloved spot of the table, right? And would that powerful and wealthy woman in her own right have taught her husband to stand up for what he believes in? Mary, his wife, gave him courage, as it is with the best of women. What we do know is this: Jesus and all the compassionate men who we have known are taught by compassionate women. And that's what I mean when I talk about the divine feminine. It's the power of intuition and compassion. Not as over and against intellectualism and rationalism, but as a complement. Is it possible that this man, Jesus, got all this wisdom that he was imparting into the world to live in a certain way that would be compassionate and loving without some influence of women in his life? As I think back to my budding feminism as a boy, I of course realize now as the father of 5 daughters that the patriarchal world in which we live is alive and well. Women are still, sadly, struggling to come to power. Listening to Michelle Obama at the opening of the Obama Library gave me hope once again that perhaps someday this country of ours could elect a woman as president, right? Someday. If only we could carry the light long enough. If only we can carry the light long enough so that fierce love that is embodied in this relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus could actually become part of an American ethos. Beloveds, as the summer courses through your lives, I want you to remember that our journey is not complete. It is never complete. And that regardless of our identity, we have all been influenced by women and men in our lives, those who have brought love, regardless of the gender, have brought love to our hearts to something more powerful. Cynthia Barjot, who is a scholar and Episcopal priest, she's gone now, but she said once in a beautiful piece that she wrote for the New Yorker, she said, "The risen God is in each of us. Present, intimate, creative, closer to us than our own heartbeat," she said. Assessed through vulnerability and a capacity for intimacy. She said the imaginal realm is real, and through it you will never be separated from anyone or anything that you have loved, for love is the ground in which we live and move, and it is love that is our being, and that is the message of Mary Magdalene that is perennially coming into being. And that is the message we most need to hear. Maybe someday. So it may be. And amen.